war dog walked into a small hospital in the middle of a quiet Minnesota night, bleeding, shaking, and refusing to trust anyone. His Navy SEAL handler never made it home from the mission overseas. The dog carried something no one expected. Not just wounds from war, but a truth someone tried very hard to bury. Doctors couldn't calm him. Soldiers couldn't control him, until a quiet nurse spoke a few strange words. And suddenly, the battle-hardened German shepherd stopped fighting and listened. What this dog remembered would uncover a secret that could shake the people who sent him to war. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Share your thoughts after the story, and please like and subscribe so we can reach 1,000 subscribers and keep bringing you more powerful stories. The wind off Lake Alder carried the sharp scent of pine and cold water through the streets of the small northern town. Blue Alder, Minnesota was the kind of place where nights settled quietly, where porch lights glowed amber against wooden cabins, and the only sounds after midnight were distant trucks and the rustle of leaves. But at North Hollow Community Hospital, the quiet shattered just after 1:40 a.m. The automatic doors burst open as two military SUVs pulled up hard against the emergency entrance. Tires hissed against wet pavement. A gust of cold air swept inside with them. Inside the ER, Dr. Alan Mercer, a tall, narrow-shouldered man in his late 40s with tired brown eyes and a receding hairline, looked up from a chart. Mercer had worked rural emergency medicine for 20 years. Car wrecks, hunting accidents, heart attacks in snowstorms. Nothing surprised him anymore, until he saw the stretcher. 4 soldiers rushed in carrying it. Not soldiers exactly. Operators. The difference showed in their posture. Quiet, controlled, eyes constantly scanning. Strapped to the stretcher was a German shepherd. Blood soaked the medical padding beneath him. The dog was large, around 80 pounds. His coat the classic working line yellow and black saddle pattern, though now darkened by dirt and blood. One ear twitched weakly. His muzzle trembled. But his eyes were wide open, and they were not the eyes of a patient. They were the eyes of a fighter still inside the battle. "Trauma Bay 2!" Mercer snapped. The stretcher rolled forward. The dog's name tag clanged softly against the metal frame. Behind the operators walked a man who looked like he had stepped out of another life entirely. Gideon Vale, 35 years old. He stood about 6 feet tall, 1.83 meters, lean and hard in the quiet way of men who trained for endurance rather than display. His body moved with economy, every step measured. He wore an old olive tactical combat shirt, the fabric softened from years of use. The cuffs were faintly frayed. His combat pants, a muted green-brown, carried worn knees and slightly sagging cargo pockets. Military work boots, scratched and dark with dust, hit the tile floor with controlled weight. On his wrist rested a weathered military watch whose bezel had long since dulled from time. Gideon's face was clean-shaven, no beard, no stubble, revealing a square jaw and sharp cheekbones that gave him a calm but stern presence. His dark brown hair was cut short in a military style, though just slightly longer than regulation. His skin was light, but wind-tanned from northern winters. His eyes, gray-blue, never stopped moving. Right now, they were fixed on the dog, because the dog had belonged to someone Gideon loved. The shepherd convulsed on the stretcher. A deep growl rose from his chest. One of the operators tried to steady him. That was a mistake. Atlas exploded upward. The nylon restraint snapped. A tray of surgical tools crashed to the floor as the dog lunged, teeth flashing, paws scraping violently against the metal rails. A medic stumbled back. "Jesus!" The shepherd barked once. Not fear, war. The kind of bark that carried across gunfire. Blood seeped from a deep wound along his left flank where a jagged piece of shrapnel had torn through muscle. But Atlas didn't seem to feel it. His entire body shook as if searching for someone who wasn't there. Because someone wasn't. The handler, Micah Boone, Navy SEAL, dead. Killed during extraction in the Middle East less than 12 hours earlier. Gideon clenched his jaw. Micah had been the kind of man who laughed too easily for someone who spent his life walking toward gunfire. Tall, broad-shouldered, blonde hair always falling out of regulation. Micah had raised Atlas from a pup. The two of them had moved like a single organism on missions. Now one half of that bond was gone, and the other half was tearing apart an emergency room, trying to understand why. "Sedate the dog," Dr. Mercer said quietly. But someone else answered first. "Negative." The voice was calm, sharp, authoritative. Everyone turned. Standing near the doorway was Commander Russell Dane. Dane was a tall man in his late 40s with steel-gray hair and a narrow face carved with controlled discipline. His Navy officer's uniform was immaculate despite the long flight. The brass insignia on his collar caught the fluorescent lights. His blue eyes were cold. Strategic. He looked at Atlas not like a wounded animal, but like equipment malfunctioning in the field. "If the dog cannot be controlled," Dane said evenly, "he becomes a hazard to personnel." The room went quiet. Then he added, "Prepare contingency option." Mercer frowned. "What exactly does that mean?" Dane didn't blink. "It means if that animal continues to attack staff, we put him down." Gideon's head snapped toward him. "You're not shooting that dog." Dane regarded him coolly. "Mr. Vale." He said the name like he had been expecting this moment. "Atlas is a military working dog, property of Naval Special Warfare Command." Gideon stepped closer. He just lost his handler. Dane's expression did not change. "That is unfortunate." Atlas barked again, louder. His paws struck the floor as he struggled against two operators trying to hold him. The shepherd's eyes darted wildly across the room, searching, sniffing the air, looking for the one scent that was missing. And then something unexpected happened. A quiet voice spoke behind them. "Wait." The word was soft but steady. Everyone turned. A woman stepped forward from the back of the trauma bay. Lena Frost. She was 28, slender, about 5'7", wearing pale blue hospital scrubs and white medical shoes. Her light brown hair was tied neatly back at the nape of her neck. Her skin was pale in the cool northern way, almost translucent under the fluorescent lights. Her eyes were gray-blue, calm and observant. But what stood out most was her stillness. Most people around a furious dog flinched. Lena didn't. She simply walked forward and knelt several feet away from Atlas, lowering her posture, opening her hands slightly, breathing slow, measured, like someone who had done this before. Dane frowned. "Nurse, step away." But Lena didn't move. Instead, she spoke. 3 short syllables, not loud, not commanding, just a steady tone. Atlas froze. The change was immediate. The growling stopped mid-breath. The dog's ears twitched. His body trembled but didn't lunge. For the first time since entering the hospital, Atlas looked directly at someone. At Lena. The room went silent. Even Gideon stopped breathing. War dogs did not calm for strangers. Not like this. Not after losing a handler. But Atlas's gaze locked on Lena, as if something in her voice had reached past the chaos in his mind. Not recognition. Something deeper. Something instinctive. Atlas slowly lowered his head. Just slightly. The way trained working dogs do when acknowledging a handler. The movement was small, but it made Gideon's pulse spike. Because Atlas had only ever done that for one person. Micah. And somehow, this woman had just triggered the same response. Lena spoke again. Another short phrase. Atlas whimpered softly. The sound broke something in the room. The shepherd slowly sank back onto the stretcher. Not relaxed, but no longer fighting. Dr. Mercer exhaled slowly. "Now," he said carefully, "we operate." The surgical team moved quickly. Operators helped lift Atlas onto the gurney. As the dog passed Lena, his nose brushed her hand. He inhaled once, long, then allowed himself to be wheeled away. Gideon stood rooted to the floor. He watched Lena. "You've done that before," he said quietly. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked toward the closing surgery doors. Her expression was difficult to read. Not pride, not fear. Something closer to regret. The operating room doors swung shut. Silence settled over the ER. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Then Gideon noticed something. On Atlas's collar, a small strip of fabric tied beneath the metal tag. He untied it carefully. Inside was a folded piece of cloth, and written in black ink, Micah's handwriting. Gideon felt the floor shift under him as he read the words. "If Atlas survives, don't let Dane take him." Gideon looked up slowly. Across the room, Commander Russell Dane was watching him. Not surprised, just patient, as if he already knew that message existed, and knew Gideon would eventually read it. The wind rattled the hospital windows. Somewhere in the distance, a snowplow groaned along the road by the lake. Inside North Hollow Hospital, the war had followed Atlas home, and Gideon Vale had just realized something terrible. Micah hadn't only died on that mission. He had died trying to warn someone. The hallway outside the surgical wing of North Hollow Community Hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic and cold air that seeped in whenever the outer doors opened. It was nearly 3 in the morning now, and the quiet town of Blue Alder lay dark beyond the windows. Inside the hospital, the night had not yet settled. Through the glass panel of the operating room, faint movement could be seen, shadows passing under bright surgical lights. The operation on Atlas had been underway for almost 40 minutes. In the corridor outside, Gideon Vale leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. Up close, the exhaustion in his face was easier to see. The harsh fluorescent lighting sharpened the lines along his square jaw and the faint crease between his brows. His gray-blue eyes, usually calm, now carried a restless tension. He hadn't slept since the call came from overseas. Micah was dead. And somehow Gideon had ended up standing in a small northern hospital, guarding a wounded war dog that seemed to be the last living witness to whatever had happened. Across the hallway, Commander Russell Dane stood speaking quietly with one of the operators who had escorted Atlas from the airport. Dane's posture remained perfectly composed, back straight, hands folded loosely behind him. His naval officer's uniform was immaculate, dark blue fabric crisp against the sterile hospital walls. He looked less like a man waiting on a wounded animal, and more like someone monitoring an operation. Gideon didn't trust that. not anymore. The surgery doors finally opened with a soft, mechanical hiss. A nurse stepped out first. Her name tag read Emily Park. Emily was in her early 30s, a compact woman with short black hair tucked neatly behind her ears. Her eyes carried the quick focus of someone who had worked long emergency shifts. There was a calm competence about her movements. She glanced at the men waiting outside. "He's stable," she said. The tension in Gideon's shoulders eased slightly. "But he lost a lot of blood," Emily continued. Dr. Mercer removed the shrapnel, cleaned the wound, and closed the muscle tear. The next 12 hours are critical. Dane nodded once. "Can we see him?" Emily hesitated. "Only briefly and quietly." Atlas had been moved into a recovery room. The large German shepherd lay on a padded veterinary gurney, adapted for hospital use. A thin blanket covered his torso, though his thick yellow and black coat still showed through. The black saddle marking along his back rose and fell slowly with each breath. A bandage wrapped around his left flank where the surgery had taken place. His muzzle twitched slightly. One amber eye opened halfway. Atlas was awake. The moment Gideon stepped inside, the dog's nose lifted. He inhaled deeply. Dogs always searched with scent before sight. The shepherd's gaze found Gideon. For a moment, something softened in those amber eyes. Not calm, but recognition of presence. Gideon crouched slowly beside the bed. "Easy, boy," he murmured. Atlas's ears flicked weakly, but when Commander Dane stepped into the doorway behind them, the change was immediate. The dog's breathing sharpened. His lip lifted just enough to expose a flash of white teeth. A low rumble vibrated through his chest. Not loud, but unmistakable. Gideon looked back over his shoulder. "You might want to stay out of the room." Dane's expression remained unreadable. "I'm not afraid of a dog, Mr. Vale." The growl deepened. Atlas's body tensed despite the sedation still lingering in his system. Emily stepped forward quickly. "That's enough," she said firmly. "The dog just came out of surgery." Dane paused a moment longer, then stepped back into the hallway. The growl faded. Standing near the window was Lena Frost. She had not spoken since the operation began. Under the softer lighting of the recovery room, the quiet details of her appearance were clearer. Her light brown hair, tied neatly at the back of her head, had loosened slightly from the long shift. A few strands framed her pale face. Her eyes, gray-blue like Gideon's, though lighter, rested on Atlas with quiet attention. There was no fear in them, only careful observation. She stepped closer to the gurney. Atlas watched her approach. His breathing slowed. The tension left his shoulders. Gideon noticed. "You've done this before," he said quietly. Lena didn't answer right away. Instead, she rested one hand lightly against the edge of the gurney, far enough away that Atlas could choose whether to approach. The dog extended his nose toward her hand, inhaled, then settled his head back onto the blanket. Only then did Lena speak. "I used to work in behavioral research," she said. Gideon tilted his head slightly. "What kind of research?" She hesitated. "The military called it Project Hush." The name lingered in the air. Even Emily Park, who had been adjusting a monitor, paused. Gideon's brow tightened. "I've heard the name." "Not many people have," Lena replied softly. She looked down at Atlas. "It studied how military dogs respond when they lose their handler." The dog's ears twitched faintly at the word. Lena continued. When a dog bonds with a handler, the connection isn't just training. It's neurological, emotional. When that person dies suddenly in combat, the dog's brain goes into a kind of crisis. Her voice carried the quiet certainty of someone remembering difficult work. The program tried to develop neutral phrases and behaviors that could interrupt that state. Gideon studied her. So the words you used earlier are stabilization cues. She didn't look proud when she said it. More like someone explaining a skill she wished she didn't possess. Gideon reached into his pocket. He unfolded the cloth Micah had left. The handwriting looked rougher now under the bright hospital lights. If Atlas survives, don't let Dane take him. He turned the cloth over. Below the message was something else, a set of numbers, coordinates. Gideon stared at them, then held the cloth out to Lena. You recognize this? Lena glanced down, and her entire posture changed. The color drained from her face. She looked back at Gideon. Yes. Where? A training facility, she said quietly. Old one. Northern Nevada. What kind of training? Lena hesitated. The Project Hush site. At that exact moment, something unexpected happened. Atlas stirred. His nose lifted suddenly into the air. The dog sniffed once, twice, then slowly turned his head toward the hallway. Not toward the voices, toward the direction Commander Dane had walked. A faint growl vibrated in his chest again, but this one sounded different. Not defensive, not fearful. It was the sound of recognition. The kind a dog makes when it remembers a scent tied to something painful. Gideon felt a chill creep down his spine, because Atlas wasn't reacting to a stranger. He was reacting to someone he had encountered before. Lena watched the dog carefully. He remembers him, she whispered. Gideon looked at her. You're sure? Dogs don't forget scent associations, especially traumatic ones. Her eyes flicked toward the door. If Atlas reacts to Dane like that, it means they crossed paths before. Gideon's mind raced. But Dane's a command officer. Command officers still visit training sites, Lena replied. Or testing facilities. The word testing hung in the air. Emily cleared her throat softly. I hate to interrupt whatever investigation you two are conducting, she said, but this dog needs rest. She checked the monitor. Heart rate, stabilizing. Temperature, slowly returning to normal. 5 more minutes, she said. Then everyone out. Gideon folded the cloth again. Micah's handwriting burned in his mind. If Atlas survives, don't let Dane take him. Across the room, Lena was still watching the dog. Her calm expression had cracked slightly, as if the coordinates had reopened something she had tried very hard to leave behind. Gideon studied her. You left that program 3 years ago. Yes. What happened? She didn't answer immediately. Atlas shifted slightly, pressing his head closer to the side of the gurney. Lena rested her hand gently near his ear. After a long moment she spoke. There was an incident. What kind of incident? Lena's voice dropped almost to a whisper. One of the dogs stopped trusting people. Gideon frowned. That happens sometimes. Not like this, she said. Her eyes moved to Atlas again. That dog attacked its own handler after a conditioning trial. The room grew quiet. Emily stopped adjusting the monitor. And after that? Gideon asked. The program was shut down. Lena said. But the way she said it made Gideon suspect that wasn't the whole story. Atlas exhaled softly. His eyes drifted closed. The sedation was finally pulling him into deeper sleep. For the first time since entering the hospital, the shepherd looked almost peaceful. Gideon stood slowly. "We'll talk later," he said to Lena. She nodded faintly. But Gideon noticed something. As she turned toward the door, her gaze lingered on the coordinates one last time. Not with curiosity, with dread. Outside the recovery room, Commander Dane stood waiting. He looked at Gideon. "At first light," Dane said calmly, "the dog will be transferred to naval custody." Gideon slipped the cloth back into his pocket. "That's not happening tonight." Dane's eyes narrowed slightly. "We'll see." Inside the room, Atlas slept. But even in sleep, the shepherd's ears twitched, as if somewhere in the fog of memory he could still smell the battlefield and the men who had walked through it. Dawn had not yet reached Blue Alder. Outside North Hollow Community Hospital, the sky over Lake Alder was still a deep iron gray, the kind of color that came just before first light in northern Minnesota. A thin wind slid along the empty streets and pressed cold against the hospital windows. Inside the building, the night had grown quieter. Most of the patients slept. Machines hummed softly in darkened rooms. But inside a small administrative office near the recovery ward, 3 people were very much awake. Gideon Vale stood beside a metal desk, arms folded, watching the door as if expecting it to open at any second. His posture carried the calm alertness of someone who had spent years anticipating danger. The old olive combat shirt stretched across his shoulders as he leaned slightly forward. His gray-blue eyes were sharp despite exhaustion. Across the desk sat Lena Frost, the hospital nurse who had somehow calmed Atlas earlier that night. Under the softer lamplight, her features looked even more composed. Her pale skin carried the faint shadows of someone who had worked too many overnight shifts. A few strands of light brown hair had escaped from her tie, falling loosely against her cheek. She held something small in her hands, a black data drive, no larger than a thumb. Between them stood another man. Dr. Alan Mercer, the ER physician from earlier, had removed his surgical cap and scrub jacket. Without them, he looked older, mid-40s, narrow-framed, with thinning brown hair and thoughtful eyes that had seen too many long nights. Mercer was not a military man, but he was observant, and he knew when something strange was unfolding in his hospital. "You said you found that in the dog's collar?" Mercer asked. Gideon nodded once. "Hidden under the fabric tag." Lena turned the device over in her fingers. "It's encrypted," she said. "How do you know?" Gideon asked. "Because it's military grade." She plugged the drive into a hospital laptop Mercer had provided. The screen flickered. A single file appeared. Voice_log_17. Lena hesitated before clicking. "Once we open this," she said quietly, "we can't pretend we didn't hear it." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Play it." The speaker crackled softly. Then a familiar voice filled the small room. Micah Boone. Even through the distortion of the recording, Gideon recognized it instantly. Micah's voice carried the same relaxed tone he always used when things were about to get serious. "You're probably hearing this because something went wrong," Micah said. There was background noise, wind, maybe distant rotor blades. "If Atlas made it back without me, then listen carefully." Gideon felt something tighten inside his chest. Micah continued. 3 days ago, we ran patrol near a supply compound outside Al-Shahra. A pause. Atlas picked up something unusual. The recording crackled again. I thought it was explosives at first, but it wasn't. Another pause. It was equipment. Micah exhaled slowly. Military equipment that shouldn't have been there. Mercer leaned forward slightly. What kind of equipment? He murmured. But the recording answered. Containers marked with Project Hush classification codes. Lena froze. Her fingers stopped moving on the keyboard. Micah's voice continued. The program was supposed to be shut down years ago, but someone kept it running. Another breath. And it's worse than what we heard about. The wind grew louder in the background of the recording. They're modifying the dogs. Gideon frowned. Modifying how? As if hearing the question through time, Micah answered. Neural response testing, chemical triggers, aggression conditioning. Lena's shoulders stiffened. Micah's tone grew quieter. They're trying to make them faster in combat. A longer pause. But they're breaking them. Mercer rubbed his forehead. That's not something the military would normally risk. Gideon didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the speaker. Micah continued speaking. Atlas found the storage site before anyone else noticed. I checked the containers. Another burst of static. That's when I realized someone high up knows about it. Micah hesitated. Then he spoke a name. Commander Dane. The room fell silent. Lena slowly leaned back in her chair. Her calm expression had disappeared. I knew something was wrong when I saw him tonight, she whispered. Gideon looked at her sharply. You've met him before. Lena nodded faintly. Years ago. Where? At the Nevada facility. Her voice dropped lower. The main Project Hush site. At that moment, something unexpected happened down the hall. A sound. Not loud, but sharp enough to make all three of them turn. It came from the recovery room. A single bark. Atlas. But this bark was different. Not a growl, not panic. It was short, focused. The kind of alert sound trained dogs made when they detected something unusual. Gideon was already moving toward the door. They reached the recovery room seconds later. Atlas was awake again. The shepherd had pushed himself upright, despite the bandage across his flank. His amber eyes were fixed on the hallway beyond the door. The muscles along his shoulders trembled with tension. But he wasn't attacking. He was watching, listening. Gideon crouched beside him. What is it, boy? Atlas's nose lifted. He sniffed the air slowly. Once. Twice. Then his gaze shifted toward the hospital parking lot, visible through the window. Lena followed the direction of his eyes. Headlights moved across the dark lot outside. Another vehicle had just arrived. A black SUV. The engine shut off. A door opened. Someone stepped out. Atlas released a low sound deep in his throat. Not fear. Recognition. Footsteps echoed in the hallway moments later. The recovery room door opened. A man entered. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with broad shoulders under a long, dark coat. His hair was sandy blonde and combed neatly to the side. A short, trimmed beard framed his jaw. His name was Ethan Calder. And unlike the soldiers who had arrived earlier, Ethan carried no weapons, only a leather briefcase. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent, the kind of eyes that noticed everything. "Sorry for the late visit," he said calmly. His voice carried the measured tone of someone used to speaking in courtrooms. He looked around the room, at Gideon, at Lena, then at Atlas. The shepherd watched him closely, but did not growl. Ethan gave a faint smile. "Good. That means he remembers me." Gideon frowned. "You've met this dog?" Ethan nodded. "Once." He extended a hand. "Ethan Calder, former Navy JAG, now civilian counsel." Mercer blinked. "A lawyer?" Ethan nodded again. "Something like that." Then his expression turned serious. "I came because Micah Boone contacted me 2 weeks ago." Gideon's pulse jumped. "What?" Ethan opened the briefcase. Inside were several documents. "He said if anything happened to him, I should find Gideon Vale." He slid a paper across the desk. Gideon stared at the document. It was signed. By Micah. Back on the laptop, the recording continued to play. Micah's voice sounded tired now. "If you're hearing this, Gideon, then I didn't make it home." A long breath. "But Atlas did." Static crackled through the speaker. "That means the evidence made it too." Gideon looked at the screen. "What evidence?" The answer came quietly through the recording. "The telemetry logs in Atlas's implant." Lena's eyes widened. "They put a telemetry sensor in him," she whispered. Mercer frowned. "That would track hormone levels, neural responses," Micah's voice continued. "If anyone analyzes those logs, they'll see what they did to the dogs." A pause. "And they'll see who authorized it." Another crackle. "Don't let Dane get Atlas back." Silence followed. Then one last sentence. "Because if he does, the truth disappears with him." The recording ended. No one spoke for several seconds. Atlas lowered his head slowly onto the blanket. The dog's breathing eased again, but his ears remained alert. Gideon closed the laptop. He looked at Ethan. "You said Micah contacted you." Ethan nodded. "He believed something illegal was happening inside the program." "And you believed him?" Ethan's gaze moved to Atlas. "I believed the dog." Outside the hospital window, the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky over Blue Alder. But inside North Hollow Hospital, the truth Micah had uncovered was only beginning to surface. And now more people knew about it, which meant one thing: the danger had just grown. Morning arrived slowly over Blue Alder, Minnesota. The first light of dawn spilled across the lake like thin silver paint, touching the pine trees that circled the quiet shoreline. A layer of mist hovered above the water, drifting gently with the early autumn air. The small wooden cabin sat about 50 yards from the lake, built decades ago with thick pine logs darkened by time. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney. Inside, the warmth of a small iron stove pushed back the cold. And in the center of the living room, on a thick, folded blanket near the fireplace, lay Atlas. The German shepherd was awake. His yellow and black coat, though still dull from dried blood and dirt, looked less wild now than it had in the hospital. The surgical bandage wrapped around his left flank remained clean and tightly secured. But the dog moved carefully. Every breath lifted his rib cage slowly, the controlled breathing of an animal recovering from trauma. His amber eyes followed every movement in the room. Watching. Listening. Waiting. Near the window stood Gideon Vale. The early sunlight fell across his tall frame, outlining the worn edges of his olive tactical shirt. His arms were folded across his chest as he watched the lake outside, but his attention kept drifting back to Atlas. Gideon hadn't slept. The events of the night, Micah's message, the recording, the arrival of Ethan Calder, had pushed sleep far from his mind. Now he stood inside the cabin he had lived in alone for 3 years, realizing it had suddenly become the center of something much larger. Behind him, Lena Frost knelt beside Atlas. Her pale blue sweater, borrowed from Gideon earlier that morning, hung slightly loose on her slender frame. Her hair, now tied into a quick ponytail, caught the warm firelight as she carefully checked the dog's bandage. Atlas watched her hands with quiet trust. Every so often, his tail gave a slow, tired thump against the blanket. Not excitement, just reassurance. The sound of tires crunching over gravel came from outside. Gideon turned. She's here. Moments later, the cabin door opened. A woman stepped inside carrying a large veterinary bag. This was Dr. Miriam Sloan. Miriam looked to be in her early 60s, though the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes made her seem younger. Her short silver hair framed a narrow face lined by years of careful observation rather than age. She was not tall, barely 5'4", but her posture was upright and confident. Her clothes were simple: a dark green field jacket over a wool shirt, sturdy denim jeans, and brown leather boots worn smooth from long use. She smelled faintly of antiseptic and hay. Miriam had spent most of her life around animals, especially military working dogs. She set her bag down and looked across the room. "So," she said calmly, "this is the famous Atlas." Her voice was warm but practical, the voice of someone who respected animals but never romanticized them. Atlas lifted his head. The dog sniffed the air, then slowly wagged his tail once. Miriam nodded approvingly. "Good," she murmured, still thinking clearly. She crouched beside him. Up close, the shepherd's size was impressive. Even injured, Atlas carried the solid muscular structure of a trained working dog. 4, maybe 5 years old, Miriam said, running gentle fingers through the fur along his neck. Prime age for a canine unit. Her hands were steady and experienced. She examined the surgical bandage. "No infection yet," she said. "That's good." Gideon leaned against the wall. "Hospital patched him up pretty well." "Yes," Miriam agreed, "but I'm not here for the surgery." Her eyes moved thoughtfully across Atlas's back. "I'm here because of what you told me on the phone." She looked at Lena. "You said the dog might have been part of Project Hush." Lena nodded slowly. Miriam's gaze sharpened. "That program ended badly." "I know." "Do you?" Miriam replied quietly. She gently parted the fur along Atlas's shoulder. Her fingers moved slowly, searching. Atlas remained still, trusting. Then Miriam paused. "There it is." Gideon stepped closer. "What?" Miriam parted the fur wider. Beneath the thick coat, just below the shoulder blade, a thin, pale scar curved through the skin, about 2 inches long, old, but surgical. "That," Miriam said softly, "is not a normal veterinary implant scar." Lena leaned forward. Her breath caught. "Telemetry port," she whispered. Miriam nodded. "Yes." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small handheld scanner. The device hummed quietly as she passed it over Atlas's shoulder. The screen flickered. Numbers appeared. Heart rate variability, adrenal response patterns, Neural activity markers. Miriam frowned. This sensor is still active. Gideon stiffened. You're saying someone implanted that in him recently? Miriam looked at the scar again. Yes. And it wasn't in his official medical record. Lena's voice was tight. That means the implant was done without documentation. Miriam nodded once. That usually means classified research. Atlas suddenly shifted. Not violently, just enough to draw attention. His nose lifted slowly. The shepherd turned his head toward the old wooden wall beside the fireplace. His ears tilted forward. The dog stood carefully on all four legs despite the bandage. Then he walked, slowly but deliberately, toward the far corner of the cabin. His nose pressed against the wood paneling. He sniffed, once, twice, then sat down directly beside the wall, looking at Gideon, not barking, just waiting, as if he knew something important had once been hidden there. Gideon frowned. What is it, boy? Atlas looked at him, then back at the wall. Lena's eyes widened. He's indicating something. Miriam nodded thoughtfully. Dogs remember places, especially if they associate them with something important. Gideon walked to the wall. The cabin had belonged to him for years. He knew every inch of it, or at least he thought he did. He ran his fingers along the wooden boards, then paused. One plank shifted slightly under pressure. Gideon pried it open. Behind the board was a narrow, hollow space. Inside, a small metal data case. Gideon stared at it. I didn't put this here. Lena stepped closer. Then who did? The answer came almost immediately. Micah, 3 years ago, before his final deployment. Gideon felt the memory return suddenly. A late night at the cabin. Micah laughing, walking through the place while Atlas explored every corner. Nice hideout, Micah had joked. At the time, Gideon had thought nothing of it. Now the metal case in his hand felt much heavier. Miriam leaned over his shoulder. Open it. Gideon did. Inside were several memory cards and a small folded document. Lena unfolded the paper. Her eyes scanned the text. This is a research log. From Project Hush? Yes. Her voice dropped. And it's recent. Miriam's expression hardened. They restarted the program. Gideon looked toward Atlas. The shepherd had returned to the blanket, but he watched them carefully, his amber eyes calm, almost patient, as if the dog understood that whatever he had just revealed mattered. Outside, the sun rose higher over Blue Alder. Golden light spread across the lake. But inside the small cabin, the truth about Project Hush was beginning to take shape. And now Gideon understood something Micah had tried to warn him about. Atlas wasn't just a war dog. He was living evidence. And someone had been watching him very closely. The days that followed at Gideon Vale's cabin unfolded with a strange kind of quiet. Blue Alder in early autumn was a place where the world slowed down. Morning fog drifted low across the lake like pale smoke. Pine needles carpeted the ground around the cabin, releasing a faint resin scent when the wind stirred them. From the outside, nothing looked unusual. A small log cabin, a narrow wooden dock stretching toward dark water, a weathered aluminum fishing boat tied loosely to a cleat. But inside the cabin, the calm was fragile, because the truth hidden in the metal data case and inside Atlas himself had begun to change everything. Atlas was healing. The German shepherd lay stretched across Chameau, a thick blanket near the front window, where sunlight warmed the wooden floorboards. His yellow and black coat had been brushed clean by Lena earlier that morning, revealing again the strong, athletic frame of a trained working dog. His bandage had been replaced with a lighter wrap by Dr. Miriam Sloan, who continued checking the wound daily. Atlas's breathing was steady now. For the first time since returning from the Middle East, the dog slept deeply, not the restless half-sleep of a combat animal. Real sleep, the kind that came when a creature believed the world around it might finally be safe. Gideon stood on the porch, watching him through the window. The former Navy SEAL held a mug of black coffee in one hand. His olive combat shirt had been replaced with a faded flannel, but the worn military watch remained on his wrist. His posture carried the quiet discipline of someone who never completely relaxed. Even here, especially now, inside the cabin, Lena sat at the small kitchen table studying the memory cards from the metal case. The glow from the laptop reflected off her pale face. Her brows were drawn together in concentration. Across from her sat Ethan Calder, the civilian lawyer who had arrived the night before. In daylight, Ethan looked less like a mysterious visitor and more like the man he truly was. Early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with sandy blonde hair brushed neatly back. His trimmed beard framed a thoughtful mouth. He wore dark jeans, a charcoal sweater, and wire-frame glasses that gave him the appearance of a professor rather than a former military lawyer. But there was something sharp behind his calm demeanor, the habit of analyzing everything. "What do you see?" Gideon asked as he stepped inside. Lena didn't look up from the screen. "These files are telemetry logs." "From the implant?" "Yes." Her fingers scrolled slowly. Heart rate spikes, neural response patterns, adrenaline levels during combat. Miriam, standing behind them with folded arms, studied the screen over Lena's shoulder. "That's behavioral testing data," the veterinarian said quietly. "Exactly," Lena replied. "And not routine monitoring." Ethan leaned forward. "Meaning?" Lena finally looked up. "Meaning someone was running experiments during live missions." The cabin grew quiet. The fire crackled softly in the iron stove. Atlas shifted slightly in his sleep. His paws twitched. Dreaming. Perhaps of running. Perhaps of war. It was 2 days later when the first strange reaction appeared. The morning had been peaceful. Atlas had eaten half a bowl of food and walked slowly down to the dock with Gideon. The dog moved carefully but confidently, the stiffness in his gait gradually fading. But when the wind shifted, something changed. From across the lake came a faint metallic sound, a distant clank. Perhaps from a fisherman dropping gear, perhaps from a boat engine adjusting its anchor chain. The sound was small, almost nothing. But Atlas froze. His ears snapped forward. The shepherd's entire body tensed. Then he backed away from the dock. Low growl. Not aggression. Fear. Gideon crouched beside him. "What is it?" Atlas didn't answer with movement. His eyes scanned the shoreline. His breathing quickened. Lena watched from the porch. "That sound," she murmured. "What about it?" Gideon asked. "Training cages." Gideon frowned. "What?" "In the Nevada facility," Lena said slowly. "The dogs heard that sound every time a trial started." Miriam nodded grimly. Metal latches on reinforced kennels. Atlas finally relaxed after several minutes, but something had changed. A memory had surfaced. Later that afternoon, another reaction came. A pickup truck drove past the gravel road near the cabin. The driver never even slowed. But Atlas lifted his head sharply. His nose flared. Then the shepherd growled, low, deep. Gideon followed the dog's gaze. "Chemical scent," Lena said quietly. "What kind?" "Military cleaning solvent." She looked toward the road. Commander Dane used the same compound on his field gear. Gideon's jaw tightened. Atlas had not forgotten. But the strangest behavior began that evening. The shepherd kept pacing toward the dock. Again and again. He would walk halfway across the wooden planks, then stop, look back toward the cabin, then walk to the boat tied at the end. Gideon watched the pattern for almost an hour. Finally, he sighed. "All right, boy." He grabbed a flashlight. "Let's see what you're trying to show me." The aluminum fishing boat rocked gently against the dock. Its paint had faded years ago. Inside were 2 old tackle boxes, a folded life jacket, and a rusted anchor chain. Gideon stepped carefully into the boat. Atlas followed. The shepherd moved directly to the center of the floor. Then he pawed at the metal surface. Once. Twice. Gideon knelt. The aluminum panel beneath the dog's paw had a seam. He lifted it. Underneath was a narrow compartment. Inside lay a small black camera unit. Dust-covered, but intact. Lena stepped closer. "Is that—" Gideon nodded. "Helmet cam." His pulse began to rise. This belonged to Micah. They powered the device using Ethan's portable charger. The small screen flickered. Static filled the speakers. Then the image stabilized. The camera showed desert terrain under harsh sunlight. Dust, wind, and the sound of breathing. Micah's breathing. The video shifted suddenly. A figure stepped into view. Not fully visible. Just boots. Military boots. And a voice. Deep. Calm. A voice Gideon knew immediately. His stomach dropped. Because it wasn't Dane. It was someone else, someone Gideon had trusted with his life. Back in the cabin, the 4 of them gathered around the laptop. The helmet camera footage continued playing. Micah stood in the desert holding Atlas's leash. The dog barked at something off-screen. Micah spoke first. "What the hell is this place?" The unseen officer answered calmly. "Above your clearance." Micah laughed dryly. "You brought my dog to sniff a classified lab?" Silence followed. Then the voice replied, "Your dog found something important." The camera shifted. A glimpse of uniform appeared. Not Navy, not standard special forces, but a research insignia. Lena leaned closer. "That's the Behavioral Sciences Division." The unseen officer spoke again. "You're asking too many questions, Boone." Micah answered without hesitation. "Someone has to." The video cut abruptly. The file ended. No explanation. No conclusion. Just silence. Gideon leaned back slowly. His hands were shaking slightly. Ethan looked at him. "You know that voice?" Gideon nodded once. His eyes were distant. "It's Lieutenant Commander Adrian Cross." "Who is that?" Lena asked. Gideon exhaled slowly. "My old team leader." Atlas lay down beside Gideon's chair. The shepherd rested his head against the man's boot. His amber eyes watched the humans carefully, as if the dog understood the weight of the discovery. Outside the cabin, evening settled again over Blue Alder. The lake turned dark blue beneath the fading sky. Inside the cabin, the truth continued unfolding. Micah had not only discovered a secret program, he had confronted someone from Gideon's own past, and now that name had returned. By the time the sun rose on the third day at the cabin, the calm around Blue Alder Lake had begun to feel like the kind of quiet that arrives before a storm. The water lay flat and steel blue beneath a pale sky. A thin breeze moved through the tall pine trees that surrounded the shore, whispering softly through the needles. From a distance, nothing about the place looked troubled. But inside Gideon Vale's cabin, the tension was growing. Evidence had begun to form a pattern. The telemetry implant beneath Atlas's fur, the files hidden in the cabin wall, the helmet camera buried beneath the boat floor, and the name that had surfaced from the recording. Adrian Cross. Gideon had not spoken that name aloud in 3 years. Now it lingered in the air like unfinished business. Atlas lay near the doorway, resting but alert. The German shepherd had regained much of his strength. His yellow and black coat now shone again after several careful washings from Lena. The bandage on his flank had been replaced with a smaller wrap, and his movement had grown steadier. But the dog remained watchful. Atlas rarely slept deeply now. Instead, he rested with one ear tilted toward every sound outside. Working dogs learned early that danger often arrived quietly. At the kitchen table, Lena Frost studied the telemetry data again. The glow of the laptop illuminated her focused expression. Her posture was calm, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed how seriously she was taking the task. Across from her sat Ethan Calder, flipping slowly through a folder of legal documents. Ethan had removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Let me understand this clearly," he said. "You're saying the telemetry logs show the dogs were chemically stimulated during combat?" "Yes," Lena replied. Her voice remained steady. "These spikes in neural activity don't occur naturally. Something triggered them." Dr. Miriam Sloan, standing near the stove warming a kettle, added quietly, "Those triggers would heighten aggression and reaction speed." She looked toward Atlas. "But at a cost." Gideon leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "What kind of cost?" Miriam answered bluntly. "Permanent neurological damage." Silence filled the room. Atlas lifted his head slightly. He watched the humans. Even injured, the shepherd seemed to sense the gravity of the conversation. Lena closed the laptop slowly. "This explains what Micah found." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Explain it." "The dogs weren't just being trained anymore," she said. "They were being modified." "Modified how?" "Through chemical injections and neural response conditioning." Her voice grew quieter. "They were turning loyalty into a weapon." Gideon looked down at Atlas. The dog's amber eyes met his. There was no anger in them, just quiet trust. And Gideon felt something twist painfully inside his chest. Because Atlas had not chosen any of this. The sound of a vehicle approaching broke the silence. Gravel crunched outside. Atlas rose instantly. His ears stood upright. Gideon walked to the window. A black SUV rolled slowly up the narrow path toward the cabin. Behind it came another, then a third. Gideon's expression hardened. "They're here." Atlas moved to stand beside him. The dog's posture shifted into instinctive readiness. Not aggressive, protective. Moments later, doors slammed outside. Boots crunched across the gravel. Then the cabin door opened without knocking. Commander Russell Dane stepped inside. Behind him came two men in dark security jackets. They were large, disciplined men with the quiet alertness of trained operators. One of them was bald with a scar across his jaw. The other had thick black hair and broad shoulders. They carried no visible weapons, but they did not need them. Their presence alone made the room feel smaller. Dane looked around the cabin calmly. His uniform had been replaced with a dark civilian coat, but the authority in his posture remained unmistakable. His pale blue eyes moved from Gideon to Lena to Ethan, then finally to Atlas. The dog did not growl, but he did not look away either. "You've had your time," Dane said evenly. "We're here to retrieve the dog." Ethan stood slowly. His tall frame placed him directly between Dane and the rest of the room. "Commander Dane," he said calmly, "before you take another step, you should know that this situation now falls under civilian legal protection." Dane raised an eyebrow. "Does it?" Ethan opened the folder. "The telemetry data inside that dog constitutes evidence of unlawful military experimentation." Dane did not appear surprised. "I expected you might say that." At that moment, another voice spoke from the doorway. "Then maybe you should hear it from the public, too." Everyone turned. Standing outside on the porch was a woman holding a camera. This was Rachel Avery. Rachel looked to be in her early 30s, tall and slim, with long, dark auburn hair tied into a loose braid over one shoulder. Her skin carried the faint freckles common to people raised in the northern states. She wore a weatherproof field jacket and carried a compact digital camera slung over her shoulder. Rachel worked as a local investigative journalist for the small regional paper in Blue Alder. But despite the modest job title, her sharp eyes and confident stance revealed someone who had spent years digging into stories others preferred to keep quiet. She stepped inside calmly. "I'm recording everything," she said. Dane looked at her, then at Ethan, then back at Gideon. "So this is what it's become," he said quietly. "A media spectacle." Gideon stepped forward. "No," he replied. "It's accountability." Atlas suddenly moved. The German shepherd stepped away from Gideon and walked directly toward Lena. Then the dog stopped in front of her. Slowly, deliberately, he positioned himself between Lena and Commander Dane. Not lunging, not threatening, just standing there, a silent barrier. The movement was so simple, it almost seemed insignificant, but everyone in the room understood what it meant. Atlas had made a choice. He was protecting her. Dane watched the dog carefully. A faint expression crossed his face. Not anger. Something more complicated. Perhaps disappointment. "You see?" Dane said quietly. "This is exactly why the program exists." Lena frowned. "What do you mean?" Dane gestured toward Atlas. "That animal would follow any of you into gunfire without hesitation." "That's loyalty," Gideon said. Dane shook his head. "No, that's vulnerability." He stepped closer. "The battlefield doesn't reward vulnerability." Rachel lowered her camera slightly. "And experimenting on dogs does?" Dane's gaze hardened. "You think war is clean, Ms. Avery?" "No," she replied. "But I think truth matters." Ethan spoke again. "The telemetry data proves those dogs were being chemically manipulated." Dane did not deny it. Instead, he said something unexpected. "You're not wrong." The room fell silent. Dane continued. "Project Hush began as research into canine trauma." His eyes moved to Atlas. But war demands results. And someone decided faster reaction times justified the risk. Lena's voice shook slightly. You broke them. Dane answered quietly. We improved them. Gideon stepped closer. You sent Micah into that mission knowing he'd find the truth. Dane did not answer immediately. Finally he said, Micah Boone was a good soldier. That's not what I asked. Dane met Gideon's eyes. War doesn't offer perfect choices. Then he spoke the words that seemed to settle over the room like frost. Only the least damaging ones. Atlas remained standing beside Lena, still calm, still silent, but ready. Outside, the wind over Blue Alder Lake began to rise. Clouds drifted across the pale sky. Inside the cabin, every person present understood something important. The truth was no longer hidden, and once truth stepped into daylight, it was very hard to force it back into the dark. The storm never came. For 2 days after the confrontation at the cabin, the sky above Blue Alder Lake remained strangely calm. Pale autumn sunlight slid across the water each morning, turning the lake into a mirror of cold silver and quiet blue. But beneath that calm surface, something far larger had begun to move. Truth had a way of traveling quickly once it was released, especially the kind of truth people had tried to bury. 3 weeks passed. By the time the first thin frost appeared on the grass around Gideon Vale's cabin, the story had reached Washington. It began with a single article. Rachel Avery published it in the regional paper where she worked, the Blue Alder Chronicle. The newspaper itself was small, barely 12 pages long, usually filled with local council updates and fishing reports. But Rachel's article was different. She titled it, The War Dogs Who Were Never Meant to Come Home. Rachel Avery was not the type of journalist who wrote with theatrical flair. She wrote with precision. Her long auburn hair usually fell loose around her shoulders when she worked late into the night, and her quiet persistence had already exposed several small corruption cases in the county. But this story was bigger than anything she had handled before. She laid out the evidence piece by piece. Telemetry data from Atlas's implant. Project Hush research logs recovered from Gideon's cabin. Helmet camera footage from Micah Boone's final mission. And one question she repeated throughout the article. Who authorized the program? The story spread quickly, first across Minnesota, then across the country. The federal inquiry followed almost immediately. A man named Special Agent Daniel Harper arrived in Blue Alder 4 days after Rachel's article appeared online. Harper worked for the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, the branch responsible for investigating misconduct inside the military. He was in his early 50s, tall and lean with sharp features and steel-gray hair cut close to his scalp. His suit was simple and dark, but his presence carried quiet authority. Years earlier, Harper had been an Army officer before becoming a federal investigator. That background gave him a reputation for something unusual in Washington. He understood soldiers, and he did not tolerate corruption among them. Harper met Gideon and Lena at the cabin one cold afternoon. Atlas watched him carefully from the porch. The shepherd had grown stronger in the past weeks. His stride was steady again, though the faint scar along his flank remained visible beneath his thick coat. When Harper approached, Atlas stood still. The dog sniffed the air once, then slowly wagged his tail, a small gesture, but enough for Gideon to relax slightly. Good instincts, Harper said quietly. He crouched just far enough away for the dog to remain comfortable. Dogs are better judges of character than most people I've met. Inside the cabin, Harper reviewed the data with intense focus. He studied the telemetry logs for nearly an hour. The patterns were unmistakable. During the final mission overseas, Atlas's implant recorded sudden spikes in neurological activity, far beyond normal combat stress. Lena explained what the numbers meant. "These signals weren't natural," she said. "Something triggered them." Harper nodded slowly. "Chemical activation?" "Yes. And neural conditioning." Miriam Sloan sat quietly near the window while the conversation unfolded. The elderly veterinarian had seen many things during her years working with military dogs, but this still angered her. "They treated living animals like experimental weapons," she muttered. The investigation spread quickly through military channels. Several research facilities connected to Project Hush were shut down within days. Internal documents revealed something even more troubling. The program had continued under classified funding, despite its official closure 3 years earlier. Someone had quietly authorized its resurrection. That name eventually surfaced: Lieutenant Commander Adrian Cross. When Gideon heard the news, he did not feel satisfaction, only a heavy exhaustion. Cross had once been more than a commanding officer. He had been a mentor, a man Gideon believed understood the meaning of responsibility. Now that belief felt like something broken. One evening, near sunset, Gideon stood alone at the dock. Atlas lay beside him, watching the calm water. For several minutes, neither of them moved. Then the shepherd slowly lifted his head. The dog looked toward the horizon, where the last orange light touched the lake. Atlas let out a soft breath, almost like a sigh. Gideon rested a hand on the dog's neck, and for the first time since Micah's death, he noticed something strange. Atlas wasn't scanning the shoreline anymore. He wasn't listening for danger. The dog simply watched the fading light, as if the war inside him had finally gone quiet. The official findings came a month later. Project Hush had indeed been transformed from behavioral research into an experimental combat enhancement program. Telemetry data from Atlas proved that neural triggers had been used during active missions. When Micah Boone discovered the truth, he had attempted to report it through internal channels. But the report never reached oversight committees. Instead, Micah's unit had been reassigned to a mission with unusually high-risk parameters. The investigation stopped short of calling it deliberate. But many inside the military understood what it meant. Micah Boone had become a liability. Commander Russell Dane resigned quietly during the investigation. No criminal charges were filed against him, but his career ended. Adrian Cross faced a far harsher outcome. Evidence tied him directly to the reactivation of Project Hush. He was removed from command pending court-martial proceedings. Atlas's role in the investigation made him something unusual. Not just a working dog, but a witness. The telemetry logs stored in his implant had been the final proof investigators needed. Without Atlas, the program might have remained hidden. Eventually, a formal decision arrived from Naval Special Warfare Command. Atlas would be medically retired from service. His handler was gone, and the dog had suffered neurological stress from the experimental triggers. Under military protocol, retired working dogs were usually transferred for adoption. But this case was different. Atlas already had a place. It happened quietly. No ceremony, no reporters. Just a letter delivered one morning. The Navy officially transferred Atlas's ownership to Gideon Vale. When Gideon read the document, he sat silently for several minutes. Then he walked outside. Atlas followed him across the grass, That morning, the lake was calm again. Lena sat on the cabin porch wrapped in a warm blanket, watching the early sunlight rise over the water. The months of tension had faded from her face, but the quiet seriousness in her eyes remained. She had left Project Hush years earlier believing she had failed the animals she worked with. Now she finally knew the truth had not been lost. Gideon worked along the wooden fence near the edge of the property. The old boards had begun to warp with age, and he was replacing them slowly. It was simple work, honest work, the kind that allowed a man to think without drowning in memory. Atlas trotted across the grass, not running, just moving with easy confidence. His coat shone in the morning sun. He stopped between Gideon and Lena. The shepherd looked at each of them in turn. His amber eyes were clear now, no longer clouded by confusion. Gideon rested his hand on the dog's head. "Looks like you're home, boy." Atlas wagged his tail slowly. The movement was gentle, content. Lena smiled faintly from the porch. "Do you think he understands?" Gideon considered the question. Then he looked down at the dog again. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think he does." Because Micah Boone had not only left behind evidence, he had left behind something stronger, a truth no one could erase, and a reminder that loyalty, real loyalty, was not something that could be manufactured in a laboratory. It was something earned, given freely, and sometimes protected by a dog who refused to forget. He was taught to obey, to fight, and to protect. But what saved the truth in the end was not a weapon, not power, and not even the military system that created him. It was loyalty. A dog that refused to forget his handler, a man who refused to ignore his conscience, a woman who refused to stay silent about what was wrong. And sometimes that is how God works in the world. Not through thunder or miracles that shake the sky, but through small acts of courage placed in ordinary people. Through a loyal animal that remembers the truth. Through a quiet decision to stand up when it would be easier to walk away. The Bible reminds us that truth always finds its way into the light. No matter how deeply it is buried, no matter how powerful the people who try to hide it, God sees what happens in the dark. Micah's voice could have been lost. Atlas could have been silenced. But somehow the right people crossed paths at the right time. Sometimes we call that coincidence. But sometimes it may be something more. Maybe it is God reminding us that justice still matters, and that even in a broken world, courage and compassion can still change the course of a story. In our everyday lives, we may never face a battlefield, but we all face moments when we must choose between silence and truth, between comfort and doing what is right. And often the difference between the two is simply the decision to care. So if this story moved you, take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment and tell us what part of this story touched your heart the most. And if you believe that stories about loyalty, courage, and faith still matter in this world, consider subscribing to the channel so more people can hear them. May God watch over you and your family. May He give you strength in difficult times, wisdom in hard decisions, and peace in your heart. And may we never forget that sometimes the purest loyalty in this world comes from those who cannot speak, yet somehow teach us the most about love, truth, and faith.